Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon. I'll try not to give you indigestion after your sandwiches and crisps. But I will start with a bold claim, and that is this. In the 3 days of excellent content over this Casual Connect event, I'm going to suggest to you that this one is the most important. Not the most interesting or uplifting, perhaps, but the most important. Now, I hasten to say that's not because it is me speaking to you. There are many others who would do at least as good a job and probably a much better job. But I do believe this subject of regulation is a key one for this industry, and that this is not properly appreciated. Now, any industry and every business has to operate within a certain framework of regulation. That's just the way it is. Corporate life, taxation, etc. But many industries have an additional layer of, if you like, bespoke regulation with which they have to comply. And if you drew a horizontal line, X and Y, then at one end of the spectrum you would have sort of low regulation, and the other end high regulation. And you could take any industry and plot where it appears on that line. So for example, if I want to start a bank, then I'll be fairly highly regulated because a whole load of regulation dealing with financial services, etc. Perhaps closer to home, if I want to start an online gambling company, there's a high level of regulation. I have to get a license, I have to comply with the conditions of that license. And that's even where you can do that at all. The games industry has traditionally enjoyed a wonderful position at the low end of regulation past the spectrum. And it's been great. We've flourished, we've prospered, but that is changing. So in the short time I have this afternoon, I'm just going to ask a few questions, 4 questions to be precise. First, who do we mean by regulators? Why are they becoming more significant? What are they doing? And how does the industry need to respond? So first of all, who do I mean by regulators? Well, here's a Wikipedia definition for you. Public authority or government agency responsible for exercising autonomous authority over some area of human activity in a regulatory or supervisory capacity. So put simply, you typically got the legislator, they create some kind of body, they devolve to that body a layer of power and responsibility for a particular area of commercial life. So here in the UK, you have these people, particularly the Advertising Standards Authority, dealing with advertising regulations, the Competition and Markets Authority, dealing with consumer issues, competition issues, our friends the Gambling Commission, who speak for themselves, and the House of Commons, who are an outlier here because they are the legislator, but they do set up select committees who operate a bit like regulatory authorities. I'll come on to that. Now, these are just examples from the UK, of course, because we're here and I'm an English lawyer, but you can have similar examples all over different jurisdictions. And I broaden this out to include some direct governmental intervention in territories where the rule of law is interpreted in a slightly different way, and, of course, international agencies, and you've seen about the World Health Organization. So there's a whole range of regulators, and I use that term fairly broadly. So that's who they are. Why are they becoming more significant? I think you can answer that question in 2 ways. The first is simply the growth and development of the industry, both in terms of its size and reach, and in terms of the nature of what it does, and in particular, of course, our monetization models. There's the old Latin expression, nobilis oblige, with responsibility, with power or significance comes responsibility. So from an obscure part of the sort of technology industry, we've now become a mainstream media and entertainment business with a third of the world playing games, and we celebrate and enjoy the wonderful success the industry's had. But with that comes, attention and responsibility. So that's one way of answering the question. The second is this. It's the potential impact it has on us as an industry and for the businesses within it. And this was about this time last year, all the news broke about the loot box issue in the Netherlands and Belgium. And that led to companies like Valve and EA having to change business models for those jurisdictions. And you may say, well, they're sort of small jurisdictions, but that's just the beginning of what's happening. So that's rather significant. So my third question, what are they doing? And I'll answer this in three ways. The first is around monetization. The second is what I've called over-engagement, or the A word. And the third is this wider net of digital regulation. Because we are often seen as just part of this broad technology industry. And along the spectrum that I outlined at the beginning, technology industries have traditionally been very low regulated industries. And you think of what's happening with companies like Airbnb and Uber, who start out little platforms to share resources and facilities and to join people together. And they both have faced increasingly strong regulatory headwinds. And companies like Facebook and other social media platforms who have gone from being, if you like, the mere conduit, we're not a publisher, we just provide a technology facility, to absolute front and center in the mind of regulators. And the games industry, of course, then caught up within everything else that's going on around companies like that. So very briefly, for those three areas, monetization. A few examples here, again from the UK. So, of course, the Advertising Standards Authority took action against our friends Electronic Arts over the mobile game Dungeon Keeper. Because advertisers a free-to-play game, it was decided it was so difficult to play without actually paying some money that you couldn't legitimately call it free-to-play. It had all the stuff starting in the UK, but sweeping across Europe and into the States around what I've called exhortations to children, so overly aggressive sales techniques, which in the UK led to the CMA's principles, which we now have to comply with. Of course, gambling, loot box issue rolls on. And then you think, well, hang on, we've got subscriptions coming. That must be immune from these sorts of problems. No, because just last month, the CMA launched an investigation into the Switch, PlayStation, and Xbox stores around their auto-renewal systems of subscriptions. So subscriptions isn't an answer to these issues. So monetization is and remains a big issue. The second is what I've called over-engagement, and you've seen just helpfully a few days ago, the World Health Organization has categorized gaming disorder as an illness. Just across the road in the House of Commons, when they're not talking about Brexit, they're doing just a few other things, and one of them is an investigation into immersive and addictive technologies. And a number of people from this industry have been invited to come and meet with the committee to have a chat and a cup of tea and to talk about those kind of things. And do not underestimate what may come out of that. And then I mentioned the wider net of digital regulation and what's happening around Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, etc. One of the other things to come out of the House of Commons across the road is the Online Harms White Paper, huge tome. Doesn't mention the games industry, but the games industry is caught up in that. Lots of potential stuff there that the industry needs to be aware of. The ICO, which is the UK data protection regulator, has got a consultation out around children's data. I mean, just to give an example, even if you think you're not targeting children, if some of these proposals go through, you'd have to be able to demonstrate that your services are not likely to be used by children. So that's a really high standard to try to have to meet. Now, you'd have to go some to respond to this consultation because the closing date is the 31st of May. But that's just privacy, and that's just the UK. So there's a whole load of stuff going on. And then, of course, just because I couldn't fit it anywhere else, there's unionisation issues, which is slightly off my topic, but it's becoming an increasing issue for us to address as an industry. So, coming on to how I think the industry needs to respond. Well, the first and kind of obvious point is don't ignore it. Now, I think I've put ignore into two categories. There's ignore in the sense of the child holding its hands against its eyes, saying, I can't see you, therefore you can't see me. So this is a problem that's, it's going to go away. It's not real. I'm being misunderstood, etc., etc. It's not going to go away. Don't ignore it. The second category of ignore is what I call the technical answer. And you hear this a lot around the loot box debate, because people will say, quite rightly, that in many jurisdictions, loot boxes are not gambling. The Gambling Commission in the UK have said that. And that's all well and good, but it's a very, very technical answer as to whether a particular mechanic falls within legislation as currently defined. And it's not, in my view, a complete answer, because it doesn't answer some of the concerns around the mechanic. So I think a technical answer may be very clever, but not always especially helpful. So don't ignore. Now, a few more general responses. Obviously, keep informed of developments. As I just mentioned, lots going on. And I've just talked about largely the UK, but there's other things in other jurisdictions. And I would say engage with and support trade associations, because I do think trade associations have a very important role to play in this discussion. But they can only help you insofar as you help them. Now, I'm not here to sell trade associations. But I'll say, generally speaking, they try and do a decent job. But they will, in a sense, aggregate the information and input that they get from the industry and direct it in a particular way. And, of course, that may or may not be very helpful. And I talked about the technical response, and I think sometimes trade associations can provide a very technical response because that's what their members are telling them that they want them to say. But that may be not the best response. And I think there's a bit more of a debate and dialogue that can go around that as to how the industry should be responding to some of these issues. But help your trade associations and make sure that what they're saying is what you think they should be saying. I put factor into product development. Now, I don't want to be unfair, but this was a recent example. So apologies to anyone from Zynga here, but it was a recent interview with the president of publishing at Zynga in gamesindustry.biz. And let me just read you a few things from this interview. We're really excited about the engagement of our players in our titles. Some of the key metrics we look at are not only the total audience base, but the number of times players engage with our titles on a daily perspective. Usually, more time spent in games has this really fortuitous effect of additional revenue. So one of the key things we really do push is how do we deliver content in bold beats that drives deeper player engagement. As the article points out, in Q4 of 2014, Zynga had 1.1 million paying customers a month, representing just 2.2% of their player base. So as the article continues, they said, well, given Kim's publishing's continued emphasis on engagement and route to monetization, we ask about the position on the WHO, etc. He seems entirely unprepared for the question. And there's a lot of stuff about how wonderful games are and how he enjoys playing them and how they're fun, etc., etc. When asked what that answer has to do with this question, a Zynga representative steps in to offer a more finite answer through email. And that comes later today, which is a more sort of politically correct answer. And that is all a little bit worrying to my mind, particularly when you see some of the questions that are being asked at the Select Committee in the House of Commons. And if you really get bored of life, you can actually go on and watch it all because it's all streamed online. So, for example, and I have done some of this, just to say what a sad chap I am, there are 10 questions that come up in different forms. One of them is this: do you agree with various trade bodies who all say that games businesses have an incentive to keep people playing as long as possible? Now, if you're sitting before that committee, that feels like a pretty uncomfortable question to me, and the answer in this article would not go down well. So how are we going to have to sort of evolve our product development to reflect some of these issues? And I would say, beyond that, factor into some strategic considerations. Now, I've been slightly unfair on one publisher, but let me sort of be a little bit more bold and helpful about another, because another GamesIndustry.biz interview with the head of operations of Microsoft, Dave McCarthy, when asked about the row about loot box and gambling, he doesn't give a complete denial. Things are a bit spotty, and the story isn't complete, and we learn to do more. But he goes on, and he recognises that there are issues. We've got to be clear on our stance, have a balanced approach to a gaming lifestyle. We need to state that's a value of ours, and it's actually a much more sort of I think helpful response. You can't deny that some of these problems exist. I think to do that is just inviting more regulation, and the industry has to just take this on board, recognise there are issues that we should all be concerned about. There is still a window of opportunity, in my view, for self-regulation around a lot of these issues. It is the favoured route for most governments, certainly the UK government. They would not willingly choose to regulate these sorts of issues or extend regulation, but they will if the industry doesn't do something about it itself. It reminds me, just to show my age, of back in the 90s when we had the issues around age ratings or lack of age ratings. And there were some sort of video nasty games that got a lot of attention, and the industry's response was largely, oh, but they're not part of the industry, they're the outliers, this is all the stuff we're doing, forget about them. Of course people aren't going to forget about them. They view us all in one bucket. And the fact that those games existed would have led to a mandatory system of regulation had not the industry, almost at the last minute, not stepped in to say, okay, we will self-regulate, here's the ESRB, here's PEGI. And they've stood the industry in pretty good stead, I would say, around the issue of age ratings. But of course, the industry has moved on in terms of different platforms, and age ratings hasn't really kept up. But there is a window of opportunity for the industry to do something around this itself. But if it doesn't, things will be regulated. And I would say all of this stuff is what I would call the new normal. I mentioned at the beginning the online gaming industry. For them, all of this stuff is what they deal with on an everyday basis. They have a license, they have to abide by the terms of the license, they get fined if they don't. This is really sort of like business critical, C-level type issues. And that's just the way it is. And that could be the way it is for us, but we have to wake up to this as an industry and do something about it now, ideally before it gets too difficult to do something about it ourselves, and that right is taken from us. So I would say there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that can be done. I would just encourage you all to wake up. You've come to this session, which is a start, but thank you for your attention.